20. Forgotten department stores from 1950s America where we once belonged. Imagine this. It's a crisp Saturday morning in 1954. The sun hasn't fully climbed over the rooftops yet, but there's already a quiet excitement in the air. The scent of percolating coffee drifts through the kitchen, mingling with the faint lemony polish your mother used on the linoleum floor. Somewhere down the block, a screen door slams and a dog barks twice. And then, like clockwork, she says the words, "We're going downtown to the department store." That was all it took. Those 7 words were a kind of magic, a passport to a world far bigger, shinier, and more wondrous than the one outside your bedroom window. You'd scramble to get dressed in your best clothes, not church best, but certainly better than the usual play attire. Maybe a pressed shirt, maybe polished shoes, hair combed, ears cleaned. This was no quick errand. This was an event. You'd pile into the back seat of your father's Buick, or walk 3 blocks to catch the streetcar that smelled faintly of oil and old paper. Along the way, you'd pass neighbors doing yard work, dads in white undershirts tinkering with lawnmowers, and kids chalking hopscotch grids onto the sidewalks. They'd wave, and you'd wave back, knowing full well that your day was going to be different, special, and then you'd arrive. The department store towered above the street, like a monument to possibility. Its windows gleamed, its glass doors polished within an inch of their lives. Sometimes there were displays already teasing the seasoned fur-trimmed coats in winter, pastel hats for Easter, red and white swimsuits for summer. Even before you stepped inside, you could feel it in your bones. This was someplace important. The door would open with a whoosh of cool, conditioned air, and just like that, you'd be inside. Escalators purred in the distance, staircases curved grandly up toward the mezzanine, chandeliers glinted overhead. Your senses were immediately overwhelmed in the best way. There was the soft murmur of 1,000 conversations, the clack of heels on terrazzo floors, the distant ding of a cash register opening, and perhaps most memorable of all, the delicate swirl of perfume drifting from the cosmetics counter, floral and powdery, sweet and adult. If you were lucky, your mother would pause at that perfume counter to test a bottle or two, letting the clerk spray a bit on her wrist, smiling shyly, then waving her hand through the air as if catching the scent like a butterfly. You'd trail behind her, past glass cases filled with jewelry that sparkled like treasure, past neat rows of gloves, scarves, pillbox hats, stockings, and cardboard eggs. The toy section was always upstairs or in the far back, past notions and housewares, but you could feel it calling to you even from the entrance. That was where heaven lived. That was where you'd run your fingers along the rows of tin cars, dolls with real eyelashes, plastic army men in barrels, Lionel trains that circled on tracks you could only dream of owning. Some stores even had a pet section, parakeets chirping in small cages, goldfish swimming in cloudy tanks, turtles under heat lamps. Others had restaurants tucked into the mezzanine, where ladies in gloves would sip tomato bisque and nibble on cucumber sandwiches, or lunch counters, where you could order a grilled cheese and a chocolate malt, the straw too thin to draw up the milkshake unless you huffed with all your might. You didn't need to buy anything. Just being there was enough. Department stores in the 1950s weren't just places to shop. They were temples of aspiration, cathedrals of commerce, playgrounds for the imagination. They were places where a young boy from a small town could walk past a 3-piece suit and think, maybe one day. Where a girl could try on patent leather shoes and feel like a movie star. Where a housewife could run her fingers along the smooth porcelain of a washing machine and believe, even for a second, that her life might be made a little easier. For many families, these stores were where the rituals of modern life played out. Back-to-school shopping, holiday wish lists, wedding registries, layaway plans, your first fitted bra, your first sports coat, your mother's Easter dress, your father's retirement watch. They were more than buildings. They were memory factories. But memory, as it turns out, doesn't keep the lights on. Over time, slowly at first and then all at once, these towering institutions, once so central to American life, began to dim. Some were swallowed by debt. Others failed to modernize. Many were simply undone by the rise of shopping malls, big box stores, and eventually a thing called the Internet. One by one, they disappeared. And along with them went the escalators, the lunch counters, the perfume clerks, the satin-lined boxes, the soft jazz of a string quartet playing near the elevator bay. Gone, too, was that special kind of Saturday magic. But not entirely. Because here's the thing about memory. It survives in the details. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the smell of buttered popcorn near the basement level, the way your hand felt in your mother's as she led you past the fine china, the candy cane given out at Christmas time by a store Santa who remembered your name. So today, we remember. We remember the names of the stores, yes. But more than that, we remember what it felt like to walk through their doors, to breathe in the air of possibilities, to be small in a very big world, but never unimportant. These are the stories of 20 department stores that once defined an era, shaped a culture, and colored the memories of millions. They are gone now. But their echoes still whisper in our hearts every time we pass a shuttered storefront or unwrap a keepsake that still bears one of their labels. Let's go back one store at a time. There was a time when the name W.T. Grant meant more than just shopping. It meant promise. It meant access. It meant walking into a store with only a little cash in your pocket and walking out with a new television, a set of dishes, or a warm winter coat, all because someone trusted you to pay it off later. In 1906, William Thomas Grant opened a modest store with a bold idea: sell quality merchandise at prices no higher than 25 cents. It was a philosophy rooted in simplicity and dignity because he believed everyone, no matter their income, deserved to furnish a better life. Fast forward to the 1950s, and that little idea had grown into a retail empire. Over 500 W.T. Grant stores stretched across the American landscape, from small towns in Pennsylvania to big cities like Los Angeles. And these weren't dingy little shops tucked into alleys. No, these were proud, brightly lit, full-service department stores where you could buy a dress, a dining set, a toaster, and toys for the kids, all under one roof. But more than their inventory, W.T. Grant had something most others didn't: trust. They offered store credit not just to the wealthy or the business-minded, but to the average American, to people living paycheck to paycheck, to young couples starting out, to single mothers and factory workers and dreamers. You could buy now, pay later, and walk out the door with your dignity intact. Credit was paper-based in those days, no plastic cards yet. Just a handshake, a signature, and a promise. W.T. Grant believed in that promise. Maybe too much. By the mid-1970s, the numbers were staggering. The company had extended over $600 million in credit to customers, much of it to people who had never held a credit account before. It sounded like success. The economy was humming. People were consuming like never before. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to spread. The trouble was, many of those loans weren't being paid back. And as Grants expanded, opening larger and larger stores in newer and more expensive locations, the costs outpaced the profits. The old stores couldn't carry the weight of the new. It was like a chain built on invisible links, and one by one, those links began to snap. In October of 1975, it all collapsed. W.T. Grant filed for bankruptcy in what was then the second largest retail failure in American history. By February 1976, the doors were locked. 80,000 employees lost their jobs. Creditors howled, customers mourned, and just like that, a giant vanished. Today, you won't find a W.T. Grant sign anywhere. No revival brand, no hipster reboots, no vintage retrospectives. Unlike Woolworth's or Montgomery Ward, W.T. Grant slipped quietly into history. Its buildings became other stores, or parking lots, or nothing at all. But for those who remember, W.T. Grant was more than a place to buy socks or televisions. It was a place that believed in you before banks did. A place where signing your name meant something. Where shopping didn't just make life easier, it made you feel seen. W.T. Grant didn't just sell things, it sold possibility. And for a while it changed how America lived. If you walked the streets of Manhattan in the 1950s, you couldn't miss it. Gimbels was everywhere. The name was painted across delivery trucks, plastered on billboards, whispered over radios, and emblazoned on the storefront of one of the largest department stores in the world. It took up an entire city block, stretching from curb to curb with 10 stories of merchandise and ambition. It even had its own subway entrance because when you were Gimbels, you didn't wait for customers to find you. You built the door beneath their feet. Their motto was legendary: nobody but nobody undersells Gimbels. It wasn't just a catchphrase, it was a battle cry. Just a few blocks away stood Macy's, sleek, proud, and polished. The two stores were rivals in the purest, most American sense. If Macy's launched a sale, Gimbels cut their prices lower by lunchtime. If Macy's hosted a fashion show, Gimbels followed with a bigger one. Behind the scenes, they even had spies, store detectives with notebooks, scribbling down layouts, prices, promotions. It was capitalism dressed in gloves and pearls, with a knife tucked into the waistband. Their rivalry inspired headlines and legends. It even birthed one of the most beloved holiday films of all time. In Miracle on 34th Street, 1947, Gimbels and Macy's finally learned to cooperate, at least on screen. In real life, the peace never came. But Gimbels wasn't just about pride or price. It was about presence. It was where generations of New Yorkers went to buy school uniforms, wedding gifts, Thanksgiving decorations. It was tradition, and it was Gimbels, not Macy's, who invented the Thanksgiving Day Parade. In 1920, they led elephants and lions from the Central Park Zoo down to their store at Herald Square. Bands played, floats rolled, crowds cheered. It was a spectacle. Macy's copied the idea 4 years later and eventually made it famous. But anyone who knew the city's history would tell you Gimbels did it first. The store itself was a marvel. On any given day, it might have housed a live piano demonstration, a bridal runway show, or a celebrity appearance. The elevators had operators in uniform. The restrooms were immaculate. The toy section was a dream, especially at Christmas time. But as the decades rolled on, the city changed. People moved to the suburbs. Malls popped up like mushrooms. Discount retailers offered lower prices with less glamour. Gimbels, built for a different kind of America, began to fade. By 1986, after 144 years in business, Gimbels closed its doors forever. The flagship store still stands, but now it houses a modern mall, its soul replaced with fluorescent lighting and fast food counters. Ironically, one of the tenants for years was a Kmart. For older New Yorkers, the name Gimbels still carries weight. It stirs something deep, an era of grand window displays, bustling escalators, the scent of roasted nuts in the air. It reminds them of parades, of rivalry, of a time when shopping downtown was more than a task. It was a memory in motion. And in that memory, Gimbels still shines. There are certain names that, when spoken aloud, still spark curiosity, if not confusion. E.J. Corvette is one of them. Most people assume the E.J. stood for something grand, Executive Junction, perhaps, or Eastern Jewel. Others swore the name had military roots, that Corvette referred to a type of warship, a nod to post-war patriotism. But the truth was far simpler. It was short for Eugene Joseph Corvette, a World War II Navy veteran with a radical idea and a stubborn streak a mile wide. In 1948, Eugene opened a modest second-floor shop in Manhattan with a promise that would shock the retail world: brand-name merchandise, dirt-cheap prices, and no frills whatsoever. No marble floors, no velvet ropes, just products stacked high, marked low, and sold fast. It wasn't elegance he was after. It was volume. By the early 1950s, Corvettes had exploded into one of the most disruptive forces in American retail. While traditional department stores clung to dignity and display, Corvettes cut to the chase. They didn't woo you with ambiance, they grabbed you by the wallet. If a record album cost $4.99 at the competition, Corvette sold it for $3.29. Name brand blenders? Cheaper. Televisions? Cheaper. Designer shoes? Close enough. They angered manufacturers by undercutting suggested prices, but Corvette didn't care. He fought legal battles. He won in court. He won with customers. He changed how America thought about shopping. Perhaps nowhere was Corvette's brilliance more evident than in its record department. For teenagers in the 1950s and 60s, it was sacred ground. Rows upon rows of albums filled the aisles: Elvis, Buddy Holly, later the Beatles. There were listening booths where kids could sample tunes before buying. It wasn't just commerce, it was culture. Kids would spend hours there, sometimes with a parent waiting impatiently on a bench, sometimes in secret on a school day skipped. In an era before online playlists or YouTube rabbit holes, Corvettes was how you discovered the music that shaped your life. The stores grew. Giant parking lots, massive footprints, warehouse-style interiors that looked nothing like the gilded halls of Bonwit Teller or Saks. But people came. Oh, did they come. Yet success, as it so often does, led to overreach. Corvettes expanded too quickly, management thinned, customer service weakened, inventory controls got sloppy, and by the 1970s, the chain that once felt revolutionary began to feel tired. In 1980, the last Corvette store closed its doors. The empire was no more. Eugene Joseph Corvette lived until 2012. In his later years, he looked back not with regret, but with clarity. "I got greedy," he once admitted. Simple as that. Still, for anyone who remembers the thrill of grabbing a Beatles LP for a few bucks less, or hearing a song for the first time in a booth with scratchy headphones, Corvette's wasn't just a discount store. It was where savings met soul, where rebellion wore a price tag, where America, for a moment, shopped fast and loud and loved every second of it. The name sounded like a joke, a placeholder someone forgot to change. Just two guys, that's it? But for anyone who grew up in New Jersey or anywhere in the Northeast, really in the 1950s and 60s, two guys wasn't funny. It was legendary. The story began in 1946 in the quiet town of Harrison, New Jersey, when two brothers, Herbert and Sidney Hubschman, returned from the war and had an idea. They started buying surplus goods from the U.S. government, everything from toolkits to toasters, and reselling them at deep discounts in a converted supermarket. No frills, just piles of stuff on tables, price tags handwritten, inventory changing by the hour. People didn't care what it looked like. They cared that it was cheap. And two guys gave them what they wanted: fast, affordable, unpredictable shopping. By the time the 1950s arrived, two guys had evolved into something entirely different. No longer a surplus store, it had become a full-fledged department store on steroids. The stores were massive 150,000 square feet of retail chaos. They sold clothes, appliances, jewelry, furniture, carpeting, paint, sporting goods, and more. Some stores had attached supermarkets. Others had automotive centers. It was the kind of place where you could buy a suit, a sofa, a lawnmower, a frozen turkey, and a tire all before noon. Their slogan, "Two Guys Has It for Less," wasn't empty marketing. It was real. The brothers had discovered that if you bought in enormous volume, you could cut prices so low the competition gasped. They'd order 10,000 televisions at a time, shaving dollars off each unit. Customers noticed. And they came in droves. Weekends were wild. Parking lots overflowed. Aisles jammed with strollers, shopping carts, and curious kids tugging at their mothers' sleeves. It was loud. It was crowded. It was borderline unmanageable. But it worked. There was a kind of working-class joy to the madness. Fathers haggled for power drills. Mothers hunted markdowns in the linen section. Teenagers snuck off to the record bins or ogled the cameras. And always, there was that rush, the thrill of the deal. But like so many success stories of mid-century retail, two guys flew too close to the sun. By the 1970s, the winds were shifting. New players Kmart, Walmart, and other discount giants began entering the scene with more polish, more structure, more scalable systems. Two guys, rooted in chaos and instinct, began to flounder. Management changed hands, costs ballooned, competition tightened, By 1982, the writing was on the wall. Two guys filed for bankruptcy. In 1983, the last of its stores closed. Today, it's a name most under 50 have never heard. But in northern New Jersey, say two guys to someone of a certain age, and their eyes light up. You'll hear stories about the time they bought a stereo for half the price, or how they got their first bike there, or how crazy the checkout lines were at Christmas time. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't modern, but it was alive. Two guys didn't just sell merchandise, it sold a kind of joyful chaos, a reminder that sometimes the best shopping experiences come not in quiet boutiques, but in the roar of a bargain-hungry crowd, two guys at the helm and the hum of something electric in the air. New York was never a city shy about fashion, but in the 1950s, looking stylish often meant stretching your wallet thinner than your nerves. That's where Alexander's came in, a department store that promised elegance without the price tag, style without the sacrifice. It began in 1928 in the Bronx. George Farkas, a luggage salesman with a struggling storefront, noticed something. People weren't buying trunks and suitcases anymore. They were buying what they needed: shoes, coats, dresses. So he pivoted. He rebranded the shop, named it Alexander's after his father, and filled it with merchandise that working-class New Yorkers actually wanted and could afford. By the 1950s, Alexander's was a phenomenon. They had a formula: take high-end fashion, knock it off, sell it cheap. Couldn't afford Dior? No problem. Alexander's had something that looked 90% similar for 10% of the price. It was aspirational shopping made attainable. Their buyers scouted Europe for designs, copied them with minor tweaks, and shipped them straight to the sales floor. The seam might be slightly off, the fabric a touch stiffer, but to most customers it didn't matter. Alexander's was packed. On Saturdays it pulsed with life. The escalators were jammed, the dressing rooms overrun, the cash registers chiming like slot machines. At their flagship store on Fordham Road in the Bronx, 6 full floors of everything from coats to carpets, you could barely move. But Alexander's real genius wasn't just price, it was location. While other department stores fought for midtown prestige, Alexander's went where others wouldn't: the working-class neighborhoods, the Bronx, Queens, the outer boroughs. These weren't glamorous locales, but they were full of people with big dreams and tight budgets, people who wanted to look good without going broke. And Alexander's made them feel seen. They even had a store on the Upper East Side, Lexington Avenue, just a stone's throw from the silk and sapphire boutiques. It was a bold move, but it worked. Still, retail is unforgiving. In the 1980s, the landscape shifted. Alexander's, once the scrappy underdog, found itself drowning in real estate speculation, boardroom battles, and internal power plays. One of its largest shareholders? Donald Trump. His involvement led to media frenzy, legal wrangling, and eventually collapse. By 1992, Alexander's was gone. The Fordham Road flagship became a shopping center. The Lexington Avenue store was demolished to make room for what is now the Bloomberg Tower. Where once stood aisles of discount designer dresses, now rise glass and steel corporate, anonymous, cold. But to the women who found their first interview suit at Alexander's, to the teens who bought prom dresses that looked runway ready, and to the mothers who knew they could stretch a dollar just a little further there, it was more than a store. It was a place where dignity and discount danced together. It reminded a city that you didn't need to be rich to look rich. You just needed Alexander's. You didn't go to Ames for glamour. You went because it was there reliably, humbly, steadfastly there. In the late 1950s, America was changing. Highways were stretching farther. Young families were leaving the cities behind, trading walk-ups for split levels and busy avenues for quiet cul-de-sacs. But those suburbs needed more than houses. They needed stores. They needed Ames. Founded in 1958 by brothers Milton and Irving Gilman, Ames opened its first store in an old mill in Southbridge, Massachusetts. It didn't have chandeliers or polished brass rails. What it had was shelves full of necessities, low prices, and most importantly, a willingness to go where the bigger chains wouldn't. Ames had a simple but brilliant strategy: target small towns that Kmart, Woolworths, and other giants overlooked. In places where Main Street was fading and the nearest department store was 30 miles away, Ames became more than convenient, it became essential. By the 1960s and 70s, Ames stores were blooming across New England and beyond. They weren't fancy, but they were familiar. You'd walk in on a Saturday and see your neighbors in the checkout line. The local Little League team was probably sponsored by Ames. Maybe your aunt worked the register, and your cousin stocked shelves after school. You bought everything at Ames school clothes in August, toys in December, lawn chairs in May. They had layaway plans, the kind where you could reserve something, pay little by little, and pick it up just in time for birthdays or Christmas. It made families feel empowered. It gave people without credit cards the chance to give their children something special. Ames understood its customers. It spoke their language. No glitz, no hard sell, just a place you could trust. But like so many other regional chains, success tempted ambition. In 1988, Ames made a fatal move. It purchased a larger but troubled discount chain called Zayre. On paper, it looked like an upgrade, a bigger footprint, more market share. In reality, it was like swallowing a wounded animal. Zayre stores were underperforming, many in poor locations, and saddled with debt. The weight proved unbearable. Bankruptcy followed in 1990. They limped on through the 90s, restructured, rebranded, and hoped. But the magic was fading. Walmart was pushing into the very towns Ames had once owned. Their prices were sharper, their logistics tighter, their reach wider. In 2002, the last of Ames's 327 stores closed. Over 20,000 people lost their jobs. Today, in small towns across the Northeast and Midwest, you can still find abandoned Ames buildings vast, empty shells with faded red letters and cracked parking lots, weeds pushing through pavement where bicycles once skidded to a stop. But if you talk to someone who lived near an Ames, you'll hear it in their voice, the affection, the respect. It wasn't just a store. It was part of the rhythm of small-town life. It was where kids begged for school supplies, where moms found curtains on sale, where dads checked out socket wrench sets on Father's Day. Ames may not have changed the world, but in the corners of America that the world often forgot, it mattered. If Alexander's was where you went to look rich, Bonwit Teller was where the already rich went to feel seen. By the 1950s, Bonwit Teller stood like a jewel box on Fifth Avenue, an Art Deco masterpiece with carved panels, brass doors, and doormen in crisp uniforms. The moment you stepped inside, the air changed. Voices softened. Movement slowed. The elevators had operators in white gloves. The carpet beneath your feet was thick enough to hush a heel. It wasn't just a store. It was a stage. And the women who shopped there? They played their roles with quiet pride. Founded in 1895, Bonwit Teller had grown from a modest New York shop to one of the most exclusive luxury department stores in the country. Its flagship was more than a building. It was a declaration, a place where Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, and Jackie Kennedy bought gowns, gloves, and fine perfume. A place where salespeople didn't just suggest a dress, they remembered your name, your size, your preferences. The merchandise wasn't flashy. It was refined, understated, tailored, the kind of fashion that whispered instead of screamed. And oh, the window displays. Bonwit's windows were works of art, literally. Artists competed for the honor of designing them. In the 1950s, a young man named Andy Warhol worked there as a window dresser, long before the world knew his name. He arranged mannequins like sculptures and drew elegant backdrops by hand. People would gather outside in the winter cold just to see the Christmas windows lit like little stages of magic. It was shopping as spectacle, but also as ritual. Husbands escorted wives in their Sunday best. Mothers introduced daughters to the grace of fine retail. Girls dreamed of buying their first Bonwit dress, a rite of passage into womanhood. But times were changing. By the 1970s, the rise of designer boutiques and the slow unraveling of traditional luxury left Bonwit Teller in a precarious position. Their understated elegance began to seem old-fashioned, even fussy. The world wanted bold logos, flashy branding, youth. In 1979, the unthinkable happened. Donald Trump, still an ambitious young developer, bought the Bonwit Teller building with plans to demolish it and erect what would become Trump Tower. Preservationists begged to save the Art Deco sculptures that adorned the facade promised to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but during demolition they were destroyed. By accident, Trump said. Others weren't so sure. It was the end of an era. The flagship was gone. One by one, the remaining stores shuttered. By 1990, Bonwit Teller existed only in memory, and yet that memory glows. Ask someone who shopped there what it was like, and they won't mention prices. They'll talk about how it felt, the scent of the perfume counter, the hush of the dressing rooms, the way a silk scarf was folded and boxed, as if it were more than fabric, a piece of you. Bonwit Teller didn't just sell fashion, it sold grace, and in a world that's grown louder, faster, and less attentive, that kind of grace feels more precious than ever. In the heart of Chicago's West Side, back in 1914, two Polish immigrant brothers, Maurice and Nathan Goldblatt, opened a modest shop with a clear, heartfelt purpose: to serve people like themselves. Hard-working, frugal, family first, immigrants trying to build a better life with every dollar they could stretch. They called it Goldblatt's. By the 1950s, it had grown into a Chicago institution, a name spoken in the same breath as Sears and Ward's, but carrying a different kind of reverence. Goldblatt's wasn't glamorous, and it didn't pretend to be. What it was unapologetically was for the people. While other department stores chased the city's wealthy elite, Goldblatt's stayed true to its roots. It catered to working-class families, factory workers, secretaries, taxi drivers, steel mill men, and the women who managed homes on tight budgets. It understood them. It spoke their language. It respected their efforts. And it made every penny count. Goldblatt's prices were low, ridiculously low, and everyone knew it. On Saturdays, the stores were packed. Children clung to their parents' coats as voices echoed off the high ceilings. The flagship State Street store, 6 full floors of wall-to-wall bargains, buzzed like a marketplace. But the real legend? The basement. Down there was where you went bargain hunting with a vengeance. Broken zippers, last season's coats, mismatched shoes, dented cookware. It was a wild tangle of bins, but if you had the patience and the elbow room, you could find a diamond in the retail rough. A winter jacket for $5. A full sheet set for less than lunch money. One woman's reject became another woman's treasure. It was loud, chaotic, and absolutely beloved. And then there was the boldest move of all, staying open on Sundays. At a time when most stores were shuttered by blue laws and tradition, Goldblatt's looked at its customer base and saw the truth. Many of them worked 6 days a week. Sunday was their only chance to shop. And so Goldblatt's flung open its doors. Competitors balked. Lawsuits were filed. Politicians howled. But the people cheered, and more importantly, they showed up. Sunday sales soared. Goldblatt's wasn't just a store. It was a cultural anchor, a place where kids got their first school backpack, where families picked out winter boots, where mothers stretched a $20 bill across a week's worth of household needs. It was where a girl might try on her first dress for her first dance and afford to take it home. But as the decades passed, ownership changed. In 1981, the company was sold to outside investors who didn't know the city, didn't understand the people, and didn't honor the culture. Slowly, the spirit bled out. By the year 2000, Goldblatt's was gone. The State Street flagship was converted into a dormitory. Students now sleep where shoppers once raced for bargains. The name has faded from the streets, but not from memory. Because if you grew up in Chicago or even visited for a weekend, you probably heard it. Let's go to Goldblatt's. Not because it was pretty, but because it was ours. And in a city built on grit, that mattered more than gold. There was nothing flashy about Jamesway. The lights were fluorescent, the tile floors slightly scuffed, the signage plain. And yet, in dozens of small towns across New York, Pennsylvania, and beyond, Jamesway was everything. Founded in 1961, Jamesway entered the retail world quietly, without fanfare. Its founders, Herbert Fisher and Mervyn Weich, had spent years observing what worked in other discount chains and what didn't. Their plan was modest: offer good prices, clean stores, friendly service, and grow slowly. In a world obsessed with fast expansion, Jamesway was deliberate, and in that careful pace it earned something far more valuable than headlines. It earned trust. By the 1970s, Jamesway had carved out a niche as the kind store, the place where the clerk remembered your name, where the shelves were neatly stocked, where there was always someone nearby who seemed genuinely happy to help, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Each store had its own rhythm, tuned to the pace of the town around it. Customers came not just for detergent and school supplies, but to see familiar faces, to chat by the snack bar, to pause in the middle of an errand and breathe. Ah yes, the snack bar. It was never fancy, just a counter tucked in near the entrance, offering soft pretzels, hot dogs, sodas, and on cold days, a steaming cup of coffee that somehow tasted like comfort in a styrofoam cup. Kids loved it. Parents appreciated the pause. And for many older residents, that little snack counter became a morning ritual, a place for conversation, for community. There was something wholesome about it all, something human. You might stop in to buy socks and end up chatting with your neighbor about the upcoming high school game. You might spot your old babysitter working behind the register. You might bring your child in on their birthday, knowing they could pick out a toy without draining your wallet. Jamesway wasn't trying to conquer the world. It was trying to serve a corner of it, and it did. But no corner stayed untouched forever. By the late 1980s and early 90s, Walmart was moving in with brutal precision. Their prices were lower, their distribution unbeatable. Jamesway tried to adapt added electronics, pushed harder on promotions, but it was like holding back a flood with sandbags. In 1993, Jamesway filed for bankruptcy. Just before Christmas in 1994, the closures began. Thousands of employees were let go with no warning, no thank you, no send-off. Just locked doors and an empty space where community used to be. For the towns they left behind, it wasn't just about losing a store. It was about losing a place where smiles came free, where seniors could linger over coffee, where teenagers got their first paychecks, where life slowed down just enough to remember that shopping wasn't always about speed. Jamesway didn't dazzle, but it did something better. It cared. At first glance, Woolco felt like the future. When the first store opened in 1962 in Columbus, Ohio, it was more than just a department store. It was a revolution in scale. At over 120,000 square feet, it dwarfed most retailers of its time. Woolco wasn't a place you popped into. It was a place you devoted the afternoon to. Born as an ambitious spin-off of the venerable F.W. Woolworth Company, Woolco represented the brand's bold leap into the age of the discount superstore. The idea was simple. Take everything people loved about old Woolworths, the affordability, the variety, the accessibility, and make it enormous. And for a while, it worked beautifully. By the mid-1970s, Woolco had over 300 stores across the United States. They blanketed the Midwest and South, anchoring strip malls and shopping centers in cities and small towns alike. Their stores were enormous, stocked with clothing, electronics, tools, toys, pharmaceuticals, groceries, and even full-service photo labs. You could get a haircut, develop your family vacation film, buy a basketball, and stock your pantry all in one trip. For many families, especially in smaller towns, Woolco wasn't just a store. It was the store. It offered choice, volume, and convenience long before those things became buzzwords. It was a place where teenagers got their first job, where parents found back-to-school bargains, and where entire Saturdays could vanish in fluorescent light. But beneath the impressive scale lay a brewing problem. Woolco had no soul. The stores were big but bland. The service was polite but forgettable. And while competitors like Kmart were innovating and streamlining, Woolco remained stuck in a sort of retail middle ground too large for intimacy, too slow for efficiency. Meanwhile, in Arkansas, Sam Walton was watching. He studied Woolco's footprint. He hired their managers. He dissected their playbook. And then he built something faster, leaner, and more aggressive. Walmart. By the early 1980s, Woolco was hemorrhaging money. Walmart wasn't just beating them, it was replacing them, often literally. In 1983, Woolworth finally admitted defeat. They shut down all 336 Woolco stores in the U.S. almost overnight. More than 50,000 employees lost their jobs. Many locations were snapped up, ironically, by the same company that had studied them from afar. Yes, Walmart moved in, sometimes just days later, taking over the empty spaces like a predator claiming a fallen rival's den. And with that, Woolco disappeared from American soil. In some communities, the closing of the local Woolco marked the beginning of a slow retail collapse. Malls lost their anchors, parking lots emptied, adjacent businesses suffered. It wasn't just one store closing, it was a gravitational center losing its pull. Today, few remember Woolco with the warm nostalgia reserved for Main Street shops or mom-and-pop diners. But for a generation, it represented the dawning of a new kind of retail, bigger, louder, more ambitious. It overreached, it overstretched, and it was overtaken. But for a brief electric moment, Woolco gave everyday Americans a glimpse of what shopping would one day become, total, towering, and all under one roof. If you grew up in the Northeast during the 1970s or 80s, weekends meant one thing, a trip to Bradley's. It wasn't glamorous, and no one pretended it was. The ceilings were low, the lights harsh, the floors unpolished. But none of that mattered. What Bradley's offered was far more precious to millions of American families' real value. Founded in 1958 in New London, Connecticut, Bradley's started small, its name chosen not for a founder or a clever acronym, but simply because it sounded fancy enough to trust. It was a made-up word meant to feel like something more, and somehow it worked. By the 1960s, the suburbs were exploding, and with them, shopping centers. These new developments needed anchor stores, strong, steady retailers that could draw crowds and stabilize surrounding tenants. Bradley slid perfectly into that role, not too flashy, not too fussy, just dependable. And for working families, Bradley's was a godsend. You could buy a blender, a baby onesie, and a winter coat all in one go, and still have change left over for a pretzel at the snack counter. They sold name-brand merchandise with the labels snipped out, discontinued models, slightly imperfect furniture, last season's electronics, all for prices that beat the competition cold. And their buyers? Legendary. They had a sixth sense for where the deals were. Overruns, closeouts, canceled orders, they found them all. When a truckload of slightly scratched stereo systems was available in Ohio, Bradley's had them stacked by the front door in Massachusetts by the weekend. Their slogan? Nobody but nobody undersells Bradley's. Yes, it was borrowed from Gimbel's. But in classic Bradley's fashion, they made it their own. Shopping at Bradley's was never about prestige. It was about the ritual. Dad drifted off to the hardware aisle. Mom browsed the clothing racks. Kids begged to go to the toy section, fingers crossed for something under $5. And finally, everyone reunited at the checkout line, which was always long but always worth it. Bradley's had heart. It was unpretentious, and for many families, it became part of their story. But retail is merciless. In the 1990s, Bradley's struggled. Competition from Walmart and Target was suffocating. Expansion plans stretched resources too thin. Debt piled up. The charm that once made Bradley's feel local started to feel tired. They filed for bankruptcy in 1995, tried to restructure, and carried on. But it wasn't enough. In 2001, the last 105 stores closed, quietly, without farewell. Just shuttered doors, fading signage, and the echo of footsteps that once ran across their linoleum aisles. Today, Bradley's is a memory, a blurry one perhaps, but warm. Because Bradley's wasn't about marble floors or chandeliers. It was about helping a mom buy 3 winter coats for under $50. About giving a kid a toy they didn't think they could afford. About showing up every week, like a dependable friend, with just what you needed. It was where ordinary moments became rituals, and where saving a few dollars felt like winning the lottery. Some stores shouted for your attention. Caldor didn't have to. It earned it with quiet confidence, clean aisles, and a promise that everything had its place. Founded in 1951 by Carl and Dorothy Bennett, the store's name, a blend of their first names, Caldor, began as a humble venture in Port Chester, New York, occupying a space barely 2,000 square feet. But from day one, it was clear the Bennetts had something different in mind. They didn't want Caldor to be just another bargain bin or cut-rate chain. They wanted to bring organization and dignity to discount retail, and for decades they did just that. By the late 1950s and into the 60s, Caldor was expanding across the Northeast, and doing so with precision. Their stores weren't overwhelming, just well-designed, well-lit, and logical. Wide aisles, clear signage, neat shelves. Everything was arranged so you could find what you came for and maybe discover something else you didn't know you needed. Customers appreciated that, especially families, especially mothers. Caldor was where you went for back-to-school shopping, for holiday gifts, for that frying pan your neighbor swore by. Their red and white signage, their straightforward pricing, their no-nonsense merchandising, it all felt reassuring. You weren't being tricked. You were being served. But Caldor's real secret weapon? Consistency. In an era when other chains scrambled for attention, Caldor stayed the course. No gimmicks, no mascots, just solid merchandise, reasonable prices, and a reputation for quality that held up. Their electronics worked. Their towels didn't unravel in the wash. Their toys didn't fall apart by New Year's. To many in the suburbs, Caldor wasn't just convenient, it was trusted. And it wasn't just the products. The stores ran like clockwork. Employees were trained. Floors were mopped. The air smelled faintly of clean cardboard and possibility. It felt like the kind of place where you could take your time. But even the most dependable things can be undone. By the 1990s, Caldor had grown to 145 stores and employed nearly 18,000 people. But expansion had come with a price. They had pushed into unfamiliar markets, taken on too much debt, and lost some of their earlier focus. Meanwhile, Walmart and Target were creeping into the Northeast with sharper prices and shinier branding. Caldor filed for bankruptcy in 1995. They tried to emerge. They trimmed. They fought. But by 1999, it was over. The last stores closed in May. Some of the buildings became Walmarts. Others became Targets. The red and white signs were stripped, replaced with new logos. The memory faded quickly, but not completely, because for those who grew up with Caldor, the name still evokes something gentle, the smell of crayons in September, the weight of a new backpack in your arms, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Caldor wasn't loud. It didn't brag. It just showed up, quietly, year after year. And sometimes, that's all a community really needs. It was a store that made absolutely no sense, and yet somehow it made perfect sense. Service merchandise was unlike anything else in American retail. A strange hybrid of catalog shopping and in-person browsing, it was a place where you couldn't pick up what you wanted, but you could see it, choose it, order it, and then, most intriguingly of all, wait for it to arrive via conveyor belt. The concept started back in 1934, but it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that service merchandise blossomed into a full-fledged cultural curiosity. At its peak, it had over 300 stores across the country. Each one operated like a showroom fused with a warehouse. You walked in and were greeted not with carts and aisles, but with displays, rows of gleaming goods locked behind plexiglass or arranged in perfect, dustless precision. There were no price tags dangling from merchandise, no salespeople urging you to try the latest appliance. Instead, you filled out a form, yes, a little slip of paper with item numbers and codes, and handed it to a clerk behind a desk. And then you waited. In the back of the store, unseen workers in the warehouse picked and packed your order. At the front, you stood under fluorescent lights and watched the conveyor belt hum to life. Your purchase would glide forward in a cardboard box, announced by a little blinking number on an overhead electronic board. It felt like shopping meets airport baggage claim, with just a hint of DMV purgatory thrown in. And yet, it worked. People loved it. Why? Because service merchandise had great prices. Because it had trusted brands, especially in jewelry, electronics, and home goods. And because, despite the weird format, it had one undeniable charm. It made shopping feel like a production, especially at Christmas time. Each year, Service Merchandise printed a thick holiday catalog, a glossy, glorious wish book that kids flipped through with fevered devotion. Circles were drawn, pages dog-eared, toy dreams planned with military precision. The catalog wasn't just paper, it was possibility. Parents would brave the crowds to retrieve those wishes. They'd fill out the forms, hand them to the clerk, and stand in that strange little waiting room, hearts pounding just a little, hoping their child's toy was still in stock. The conveyor belt would roll, the box would slide forward, and for a moment, even the grown-ups believed in magic. But as the 90s dawned, the magic began to fade. People wanted speed. They wanted to grab and go. The showroom model began to feel cumbersome. E-commerce was rising. Big-box stores had wider selections. The conveyor belt no longer charmed. It frustrated. By 1999, Service Merchandise filed for bankruptcy. By 2002, the last stores closed. The belts stopped moving. The numbers stopped blinking. Today, it's almost a myth, a thing you describe to younger people with a laugh. You had to fill out a form, wait for your toaster, and pick it up from a conveyor belt. But for those who remember, it wasn't ridiculous, it was ritual. And in that strange little showroom with its clipboards and order slips and hum of rubber rollers, something very real was happening. Memories were being delivered. If you grew up in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or West Virginia, chances are you didn't just know Hills, you loved it. Founded in 1957 in Youngstown, Ohio, Hills wasn't out to dazzle. It didn't try to compete with Saks or Sears in style, but what it lacked in polish, it made up for in something far more powerful: heart. Hills stores were huge, 80,000 to 100,000 square feet of merchandise arranged with blue-collar logic. No chandeliers, no sales pitches, no illusions. Just aisles full of things families actually needed and could actually afford. They knew their customers. They served coal towns, steel towns, neighborhoods where paychecks came with calluses. And Hills embraced that reality with pride. It was a store built for working people, not around them. The clothes were durable, the furniture was functional, the toys were exciting without being overpriced, the appliances would last you through 2 kids and a dog. You didn't shop at Hills to impress anyone, you shopped at Hills to get what needed doing, done. And then there was the layaway program, a lifeline for many. You'd pick out what you wanted, maybe that perfect bike for Christmas, or a new winter coat for the kids, and Hills would tuck it away. No credit cards, no interest. Just payments you could manage week by week. It gave families dignity. It gave children magic. It made things possible that otherwise wouldn't be. But let's not forget what really brought the sparkle: the snack bar. After a long shopping trip, tired legs and grumbling stomachs found salvation at the front of the store. Hot dogs, soft pretzels, pizza that was somehow better than it had any right to be, especially when eaten from a styrofoam plate, while sitting next to your mom's cart full of school supplies and off-brand shampoo. Ask anyone who grew up near a Hills, and you'll hear it. That Hills pizza? I still dream about it. It wasn't just about hunger. It was about pause, about shared moments, about being a kid with a quarter in your pocket and a slice of pizza on your plate. But no good story stays untouched forever. In 1985, Hills acquired Gold Circle, another struggling chain. The move seemed smart on paper, but it came with problems: debt, location headaches, and management confusion. It was like 2 tired swimmers trying to keep each other afloat. By 1991, Hills filed for bankruptcy. Soon after, many of its locations were sold to Ames, another retail giant already teetering on the edge. For most of those buildings, it was a short trip from Hills to empty, but the memory of Hills never truly vanished. It lived in the scent of cardboard toy boxes on Christmas Eve, in the sound of crinkling layaway receipts, in the taste of that glorious cafeteria-style pizza under harsh lighting and linoleum floors. Hills wasn't a luxury, it was a lifeline. And for families trying to make ends meet with grace and grit, it meant the world. Venture was never loud. It didn't need to be. Whereas other retailers puffed up with slogans and mascots, Venture took a different approach: quiet efficiency, clean presentation, and Midwest sensibility. In an era when discount stores were often chaotic and cluttered, Venture felt almost calm. Founded in 1970 by two former executives from Target and May department stores, Venture's roots were planted firmly in St. Louis, Missouri. The founders had a simple vision: to create a store that offered discount prices without the discount experience. No shouting price tags, no dingy backrooms, just good products, neatly displayed, in stores that made you feel like someone had actually planned the layout. And they succeeded. For a while, remarkably so. Venture stores were laid out with intent: wide aisles, bright lighting, clearly marked departments. The clothes were fashionable, not runway ready, but better than average. The electronics were up to date. The home goods section felt curated, not chaotic. It was discount shopping for people who still cared about aesthetics. In many ways, Venture was Target before Target became cool. By the 1980s, Venture had spread across the Midwest. It didn't try to conquer the coasts or elbow into major urban centers. Instead, it planted roots in Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Indiana, and surrounding states. It became a regional favorite, a quiet constant in the lives of families who didn't want glitz, just reliability. It also understood real estate in a way many competitors didn't. Venture placed stores near major highways, in accessible areas with ample parking, not hidden in industrial zones, not miles outside of town. They made it easy to get in, get what you needed, and get home. Shoppers responded. The stores were profitable. The brand was strong. And then, like so many retail stories, the giants came. By the 1990s, Walmart and Target were expanding aggressively. Walmart undercut on price. Target began evolving into the very thing Venture had quietly built: stylish discount retail with national branding behind it. Kohl's crept in to steal apparel shoppers. Suddenly, Venture was squeezed from all sides. They didn't go out with a bang, but with a slow, painful unraveling. In 1998, Venture filed for bankruptcy. The liquidation sales were epic. Lines wrapped around the stores, prices slashed by the hour. People mourned as they filled their carts, knowing that each item marked a goodbye. By the end of the year, every Venture store was closed. Some were turned into Target locations. Others were bulldozed. Many simply sat empty, their wide glass windows reflecting nothing but the past. Today, Venture is rarely spoken of. It didn't last long enough to earn a mythic place in American culture. It didn't have kitsch. It didn't have scandal. It had efficiency, honesty, and grace. But if you ask someone from St. Louis or suburban Chicago, you'll see it: the quick smile, the soft nod. Venture, they'll say. That place had everything, and it always felt easy. And sometimes, in a world full of noise, easy is the thing we miss the most. It was supposed to be the best of both worlds. Jefferson Ward, launched in the late 1950s, was Montgomery Ward's attempt to reinvent itself, to cast off the dust of old-fashioned department store sensibilities and compete with the rising tide of discount chains. It would be newer, nimbler, a little younger, a little louder, and it would walk the line between full-service elegance and bare-bones affordability. The name Jefferson Ward was chosen carefully. Jefferson evoked respectability, history, Southern charm. Ward nodded to the parent company's long-standing reputation. It was an attempt at rebranding without disowning one's roots, a fresh coat of paint on an old house. And for a while, it worked. Jefferson Ward stores popped up across the Southeast, especially in Florida, Georgia, Texas, and other fast-growing Sunbelt states. They were smaller than traditional Montgomery Ward stores, but larger than your average discount outlet. Their goal? To strike a balance, offering national brands at modest prices, in stores clean enough to feel upscale, but simple enough to keep costs down. In towns where Sears felt too rich and Kmart too cheap, Jefferson Ward found a home. Their apparel section carried recognizable labels. Their electronics were up to date. Their furniture was stylish, if not cutting edge. For families seeking something in between, it was a comforting alternative. Not flashy, not flimsy, just decent. But in retail, the middle is a dangerous place. By the 1980s, the industry was polarizing. Department stores doubled down on luxury. Discounters slashed even deeper. And the vast space in between the almost upscale, almost affordable zone began to shrink. Jefferson Ward suddenly found itself trapped. Too polished to compete on price, too generic to attract loyalty. Their stores didn't excite shoppers. They didn't inspire confidence. They simply existed. Worse, Montgomery Ward itself was in trouble. Struggling to redefine its own identity, it couldn't prop up an offshoot that wasn't pulling its weight. In 1985, the company pulled the plug. Some Jefferson Ward stores were folded back into the Montgomery Ward banner. Others simply shut their doors. And just like that, a brand that had once held such potential disappeared not with outrage or sadness, but with a collective shrug. Today, Jefferson Ward is barely a footnote. You won't find nostalgic fan groups or retro Instagram pages. There are no commemorative coffee mugs or T-shirts with the logo. The name is remembered, if at all, by those who worked there, or those who caught the tail end of its brief glow. But the story of Jefferson Ward matters not because it changed America, but because it tried to exist in a space America no longer had room for. It was a store for those who didn't want to pay top dollar, but still wanted to feel good about what they bought. A place that tried to walk the line and discovered that sometimes the line vanishes beneath your feet. If there was one word to describe Zayre, it was this: cheap. Not in a mean-spirited way, just honest. Zayre didn't pretend to be elegant. It didn't whisper about value. It shouted it from bright orange and brown signs, from aisles stacked high with markdowns, from advertising circulars crammed with deals so good you wondered if they'd last the day. And usually they didn't. Founded in 1956 by brothers Stanley and Sumner Feldberg, Zayre took its name supposedly from the Yiddish word for very, as in very low prices. And that was the idea: sell everything, mark it down, and move it fast. And so they did. By the early 1960s, Zayre stores were sprouting across New England, then branching into the mid-Atlantic, and eventually across much of the eastern United States. The growth was explosive. In just over a decade, they'd opened more than 100 stores. By the late 1970s, that number had ballooned to nearly 300. The stores were unmistakable harsh fluorescent lighting, bare concrete floors, long checkout lines, and merchandise piled like treasure hunts. Clothes might be folded on tables or draped over racks. Electronics often sat out of boxes. Furniture might be scratched or mismatched. But the prices? Unbeatable. Zayre understood one thing better than most: if you get customers in the door, they'll buy more than they planned. So they did what few dared. They sold at a loss on key items, just to drive foot traffic. Need a toaster for $3.99? Zayre had it. Want a jacket that looked suspiciously like last season's designer version? Zayre probably had that too. They weren't in the business of appearances. They were in the business of volume. And for millions of Americans trying to stretch a dollar, it was perfect. But chaos has its limits. The stores were cluttered, the shopping experience frustrating. Inventory control was shaky. And by the 1980s, newer discounters like Walmart and Target began offering cleaner stores, wider selection, and better branding without losing the edge on pricing. Zayre tried to keep up, but behind the scenes, something more interesting was happening. In 1988, the Feldberg family made a radical decision. They sold off the Zayre department store chain to Ames, yes, that same Ames that would later stumble. But the Feldbergs didn't walk away from retail. Instead, they pivoted, reorganizing their company around a small, fast-growing subsidiary. That subsidiary? TJX Companies. Yes, Zayre became TJ Maxx. What started as a side project one store, focused on off-price designer fashion, grew into a retail juggernaut. TJ Maxx, Marshalls, HomeGoods, all of them born, quite literally, from the bones of Zayre. So, while the concrete floors and cluttered aisles of Zayre are long gone, their spirit lives on in every red tag at TJ Maxx, in every HomeGoods treasure find, in every Marshall's clearance rack. Zayre may have died, but in doing so, it gave birth to something bigger. something cleaner, something that figured out how to balance bargains with polish. Not every legacy is pretty, but some, like Zayre's, are surprisingly profitable. If you were a suburban mother in the 1950s with a shopping list and a screaming toddler in tow, Grand Union felt like a small miracle. Most Americans remember Grand Union as a grocery store, and rightfully so. It started in 1872 as the Jones Brothers Tea Company and evolved over the decades into one of the biggest supermarket chains in the country. But by the mid-20th century, Grand Union dreamed of more. In an era when department stores meant going downtown, getting dressed up, and possibly paying for parking, Grand Union introduced something radical for small towns and suburbs. What if you could do all your shopping, groceries, clothes, appliances, even toys under one roof? The result was the combination store. Half supermarket, half department store, and all convenience. To a mother juggling diapers and dinner plans, this was pure genius. One aisle had lettuce, milk, and laundry detergent. The next, curtains, dresses, Christmas toys, toasters. Some stores even sold TVs or hardware. You could pick up pork chops and a pressure cooker in a single trip and be home before the afternoon reruns started. And Grand Union did it with style. Their stores were spacious, brightly lit, easy to navigate. Their signage was modern, their logos sharp. The whole place felt like someone had borrowed design inspiration from a 1950s Cadillac, sleek, chrome-lined, and full of confidence. In smaller cities, Grand Union was often the only place offering this kind of one-stop experience. In towns that couldn't support a Sears and a separate grocery store, Grand Union stepped in and did both passably well, at least. But therein lay the problem. Grand Union was good at everything, but great at nothing. They weren't the cheapest grocer. They didn't have the selection of a real department store. And as the 1970s arrived, the lines between retail categories began to harden. Customers started expecting more specialized experiences. They didn't want socks next to spinach. They wanted choices. Grand Union began shrinking its ambitions. By the late 70s, most locations quietly phased out the department store sections, returning to their roots in food retail. The dream of the all-in-one faded not because it didn't work, but because the world wasn't quite ready to embrace it at scale. Ironically, a generation later, Walmart supercenters would resurrect the same idea and succeed wildly. But Grand Union was too early, too scattered, too unsure. By the 1980s and 90s, the company struggled to keep up with grocery giants like Kroger and Safeway. The chain limped along until 2001, when the last remaining locations either shuttered or were bought out by competitors. Today, the name Grand Union survives only as a vague echo, maybe on an old shopping cart abandoned in a parking lot, or a faded receipt at the back of a kitchen drawer. But if you lived in the suburbs in the 1950s or 60s, you probably remember it differently. As a place where shopping became simpler, where you could buy a can of soup and a pair of shoes without stepping into another store. Where, just for a while, the future of retail was already waiting between the dairy case and the toy aisle. It's hard to describe the white front experience if you didn't live through it. But if you did, if you were in Southern California in the 1960s or early 70s, you remember. You remember the parking lot packed with cars by 9 o'clock a.m. on a Saturday. You remember the massive glowing white facade that looked like the front of a temple built for commerce. And you definitely remember the jingle, white front, that's the place to go. It wasn't subtle, and it didn't need to be. Founded in 1959 by brothers Saul and Robert Guerin, White Front was named quite literally. The front of the building was painted white, bold and blank, as if to shout, "You can't miss us." And no one did. Each store was enormous, 150,000 square feet or more, football fields of merchandise stacked, sorted and ready for the taking. They sold everything: furniture, clothing, housewares, appliances, tires, toys, TVs, lawnmowers, canned soup, mattresses. If it existed, there was a good chance White Front sold it, and at a very low price. Their marketing was aggressive, even brash. Full-page newspaper ads, radio blasts, television spots that interrupted game shows, and evening news. White Front wasn't trying to be elegant, it was trying to win. And for a while, it did. In a booming post-war California, where suburbs sprawled, freeways multiplied, and shopping became a family event, White Front was perfectly timed. It captured the dream of working-class families. Big value, big choice, big confidence. On weekends, the stores buzzed like stadiums. Kids rode in shopping carts. Dads tested power tools. Moms picked out drapes, frying pans, and discount blouses. The air smelled like new plastic, floor wax, and popcorn from the snack counter. It was chaotic, but it worked. And then, like so many stories in this countdown, it didn't. White Front's biggest sin wasn't its ambition, it was overreach. Emboldened by its California success, the company expanded beyond its strongholds into cities that didn't know the brand, didn't respond to the same tactics, and didn't forgive mistakes. Stores opened too fast, margins thinned, quality slipped. Locations in Washington, Texas, and beyond struggled. In 1975, White Front was acquired by Interstate Department Stores, a parent company already dealing with financial trouble of its own. Instead of saving White Front, the acquisition dragged both under. Within months, Interstate filed for bankruptcy. White Front stores closed suddenly. There were no fond farewells, just empty buildings and neon signs that flickered one last time before going dark. Today, White Front is nearly forgotten, its name remembered mostly by older Californians who grin at the mention and say, "Oh yeah, you could get anything there." It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't sophisticated, but it delivered. And for one shimmering moment in the sun-drenched golden age of Southern California, White Front felt like the future. Big, bold, loud, and full of promise. There are stores you shop at, and then there are stores that become woven into your life, places where holidays were planned, school years outfitted, birthdays saved for. Masters was one of those places. Founded in the early 1950s, Masters was never a massive chain. It didn't conquer the country or boast of hundreds of locations. Instead, it nestled quietly into Midwestern and Northeastern towns, often in neighborhoods where other stores had long overlooked the working-class families who lived there. Masters wasn't trying to be everything for everyone. It was trying to be enough for the people who needed it most. You could walk through its doors and get a winter coat for your daughter, a toolbox for your brother, a casserole dish for your aunt, and a greeting card for your neighbor, all without going broke or feeling out of place. It was the epitome of familiarity. The cashiers knew your name. The floor tiles were scuffed in all the same places. The linoleum squeaked near the greeting cards. The toy aisle smelled faintly of plastic and paperboard. And if you needed layaway, no one looked at you sideways. Masters had a little bit of everything: clothing, shoes, household goods, appliances, toys, seasonal decorations, even candy sold near the checkout on pegboard hooks. But more than the merchandise, it had a mood. Mothers pushing carts while balancing toddlers on their hips. Elderly couples comparing dish soap prices. Teenagers trying on jackets before their first job interviews. It wasn't a place you dressed up for. It was a place you went to be real. And the store mirrored that spirit. No polished displays or piped-in music. Just the hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional ding from the register, and the steady rhythm of a community going about its day. In a world that often made people feel small, Masters made them feel seen. But like so many regional chains, it was vulnerable. As the 1980s and 90s arrived, the tide of consolidation rose. Big box stores with deeper pockets and national branding began swallowing the local competition. They offered wider variety, longer hours, and lower prices, often at the expense of personality. Masters held on as long as it could, but slowly, inevitably, it disappeared. Store by store, town by town, quietly, without headlines or fanfare. The signs came down, the shelves were cleared, and what remained was a memory of affordable warmth, of quiet dignity, of a place where life's little needs were met with patience and a smile. Ask someone who grew up with a Masters in their town and they'll tell you, it wasn't fancy, but it was ours. In the end, Masters didn't die because it failed. It died because the world around it changed, And in its absence, we are left not only with faded photos and dusty logos, but with the tender ache of remembering what it felt like to belong somewhere simple, a place where no one hurried you, where you could shop slow, where life happened in all its quiet, ordinary grace. We thought they'd always be there, the escalators, the creaky carts, the bold signs screaming sale in red block letters, the smell of popcorn at the snack counter, the buzz of fluorescent lights above racks of corduroy pants and discounted toasters, the sound of register drawers snapping shut, and the crinkle of receipts folded into purses already full of coupons and car keys. These weren't just stores. They were rituals. They were Saturdays. They were back-to-school runs, Christmas layaways, emergency umbrellas, and impulse candy bars at checkout. They were places you stopped on the way home, places you brought your kids, places you spent your first paycheck, or bought your first bra, or picked up a last-minute card for your mother's birthday. They were woven into the domestic rhythm of a different America, an America before online carts and next-day shipping, before apps and algorithms. And now, they're gone. Some disappeared in bankruptcy court. Others were bought out, renamed, bulldozed, or simply left to rot, skeletons of commerce at the edge of town. Parking lots sprouting weeds, faded signs clinging to abandoned buildings, names remembered only when someone digs through a box of old family photos and sees a plastic shopping bag that says Zayre, or Hills, or Ames. But these stores left more than empty shelves. They left traces. They taught us what shopping could feel like before it became a transaction. They reminded us that buying wasn't just about stuff, it was about place and pace, and the quiet comfort of being somewhere familiar. You didn't just shop at these stores. You existed in them. You wandered. You lingered. You chatted with a clerk who lived down the street. You ran into your neighbor in the detergent aisle. You let your kid climb into the cart and pick out a toy if the week had gone well. You smelled plastic Halloween masks in October, rubber pool floats in July, pine-scented candles in December. And even when times were tight, those stores made space for you. They offered layaway instead of judgment, bargains instead of shame. They didn't pretend to be glamorous. They didn't need to be. They were honest. More importantly, they were ours. And in remembering them, we remember a version of ourselves, one less hurried, less curated, less digital. A version that measured time not by tracking numbers, but by holiday displays. That marked seasons with changing shelves, school supplies in August, pumpkins in October, wrapping paper in December. That saw shopping not as a chore, but as a small, dependable part of life. Now we scroll, we click, we tap. The shelves are infinite. The packages arrive in brown boxes with no face, no voice, no memory. But every once in a while, when we drive past a cracked foundation or a boarded-up storefront, when a friend mentions, "Who remembers Venture?" or "Didn't your mom always take you to Woolco?" we feel something flicker, something warm, something real, something we thought we had forgotten. And in that flicker, we find ourselves back there, in the aisles, under the buzz of the lights, pushing the cart, buying nothing in particular, and somehow feeling at home. Because these places, they were never just stores. They were the backdrop to our lives. And though they're gone, they still echo, in memory, in conversation, and in the quiet wish that maybe, just maybe, we could go back one more time.